I'm on leave, so I haven't been talking to people much, so I may be a bit rusty. But this is a combination of three of my projects. One is the tablet article that just came out recently, and that is indeed about Chagall and Modigliani, and I will talk about it a bit more in a bit. The second one is a book I'm writing, and it's a book about Yehuda Pen, who was Chagall's teacher, School for Jewish Painters in Vitebsk. And of course, for that book, I was supposed to go to Vitebsk this quarter, and then you know what happened. I obviously didn't, but this is the next best thing for me, being able to talk about it. And then I'm also teaching a course which is cross-listed with Russian, Jewish studies, honors, and art on Russian artists of the Pale of Settlement. Now, the reason why I'm interested in that is partially my passion for art basically virtually equals my passion for literature. I even paint in a very amateurish way, of course. But more than that, it's personal. My father's family came from Vitebsk, where my grandfather was actually a rabbi. And they left in 1930 and settled in Leningrad. But the family law also had it that my grandfather actually knew the Chagalls, whether it was just law or it had some accuracy to it, I really cannot tell. Now I would like to show you so that you can see nice paintings in addition to my face. So this is the course that I'm going to teach, and as I said, it's cross-listed with several programs. This is the article that just came out last month, where I argue that being called a Jewish painter is not necessarily a liability. When you read biographies of Modigliani, when they deal with the issue of his being Jewish, there is always the statement about how we should not reduce him to being a Jewish painter. It is, of course, limiting to call Modigliani a Jewish painter. And what I'm arguing with the example of Chagall is that it's actually not limiting at all. And in Chagall's case, it was a definite strength. Both of them obviously competed with Picasso. And actually, you can argue that Chagall did it much more successfully. There are caveats. Modigliani didn't live as long as Chagall and all that. And it's also precisely because Chagall was so proudly Jewish and always turned to Jewish themes. He himself said, if I were not a Jew, I would have been an artist. And so what I'm arguing in this article is that by emphasizing his strong identification with his native Yiddish culture, Chagall actually appears to have hit upon a very astute, although to some counterintuitive, understanding of what could best place him in a position to even compete with the likes of Picasso. And that was, in essence, Chagall's own ism with which he could compete with Cubism, a quintessentially Jewish Yiddish artist, while at the same time a daring non-realist, which makes him as path-breaking and as original as Picasso. And actually Modigliani envied that. There are plenty of evidence that he almost wished that he was from the Pale of Settlement, that he wished that he would be more like people like Chagall and Sutin and Zatkin, with whom he socialized, especially with Sutin. There is this anecdote about how once he took out of his pocket a newspaper article in Yiddish, which someone had transcribed for him prior to it, and read it because it was about him and it praised him. There was lots of Yiddish envy in Modigliani. And if you're interested to learn more about that, I would recommend that you read the article. And Chagall definitely saw it as something that he had to establish so that other painters can sort of follow in the same path. And in 1935, he lamented that we Jews do not have our Baudelaire and Gautier and Apollinaire. We do not have the kind of a personality who with a powerful hand would forge the artistic taste and modern criteria. How can I help here? And then he also kind of has this beef with Jewish writers who, in his opinion, do not treat Jewish painters with adequate respect. He says, if only Jewish poetry, Jewish literature link themselves with other forms of art, painting among them, it would enrich them, would ensure not just their spiritual rise, but also the educational and stylistic one. And he did change that predicament. And as I argue in the article, it is high time that we indeed start viewing not just Yiddish literature, but also Yiddish visual arts as absolutely crucial elements of what we call Yiddish modernism and Yiddish Renaissance. We all, of course, know Chagall, and we know his pale paintings, and I just included 3 of them here. We know much less about some of the other painters, and among them, Yehuda Pen, who was Chagall's teacher, and not just Chagall's teacher. As you will see later, he was El Lisitsky's teacher, he was Zatkin's teacher. He was academically trained, one of very few Jews who got into St. Petersburg Academy of Art. Actually didn't get the first year, had to live there illegally because Jews could not live in St. Petersburg, but then reapplied again and got in. Very realistically inclined. His absolute favorite artists were Rembrandt and Elia Repin, a very famous portrait painter at the time, whom he actually personally knew. And yet, one part of him was very different. He was a Yiddish painter. And he actually became a role model for his students. They didn't like his realism. He didn't approve of their modernism, but that he unabashedly would paint the scenes of the shtetl, like some critics say, paint in Yiddish, was something that most of them took from him. And he was a great role model because then the most famous Jewish painter, Isaac Levitan, was actually famous for painting those essentially Russian landscapes. And he was praised for that, although it was never forgotten that he was Jewish. And as late as 1892, when he was already a famous artist, he was actually evicted from Moscow because he was a Jew, and it was deemed that he wasn't there legally. He called what Chagall did Chagallovщина. He didn't approve necessarily of his manner. He did appreciate Chagall's talent, like he did in lots of his other students. And this is my favorite. He actually remained religious through most of his life. And he apparently instructed Chagall that at the very least, Chagall should not allow the goats and cows and horses in his paintings to fly above the roofs of synagogues. Other buildings are fine, but synagogues, not above. In his school apartment, he had 4 rooms. And they were, as you can see on this photograph, from ceiling to floor. All his paintings, he didn't like to sell them. He didn't like to give them to people. He liked to keep them. And among his students who would paint in Yiddish were L. Lisitsky, Osip Zatkin, and also Yelena Kabischer, whom you will see in a bit. And that's, again, some examples of his painting in Yiddish. Issachar Ber Rybak, or Zachar Rybak, is not very well known in the West. And part of it is also probably because he died of TB way too young. He reminds people of Chagall, and there is a reason for it. He was 10 years younger than Chagall, and he was influenced by Chagall. But he is obviously a very original painter in his own right. And so the image that we had advertising my talk actually had a drawing of Rybak, even though most people probably assumed that it was Chagall. And here's another wonderful painting by Rybak, which is called The Wedding. And Rybak in his philosophy was also very close to Chagall in terms of how it's utterly unlimiting to be a Jewish painter, and actually the opposite. In 1919, he said, compared to the extreme developments in Western European art, which approach an absolute abstraction, a Jewish painter, because of his freshness, there's only one personal pronoun there, and it's his vividly fanatical and naive ability for perceiving and recreating his urgently palpitating artistic sense while employing national materials, a Jewish painter is destined to create a revolution in contemporary art. L. Lisitsky is better known than Rybak, but still not quite as well known and as much appreciated in the West. And he is, again, another student of Yehuda Pen. Some other remarkable artists from the Pale of Settlement, whom we will study in the seminar in the fall, include Osip Zatkin, again, a student of Yehuda Pen, Chaim Sutin, who became the closest friend of Modigliani, and again, whom Modigliani envied because he came from the Pale of Settlement, Leon Bakst, Nathan Altman, and a rare woman, another student of Yehuda Pen, Yelena Kabischer. This is from Yiddish Encyclopedia about what it meant to combine Jewish themes and modernism and how Yiddish painters usually do it. And that's a quote. Many Jewish artists viewed the essence of their style as deriving from Jewish folk art, particularly from representations of Hebrew letters. And you have examples of that from Lisitsky and Rybak down there. Through imitating and copying Jewish folk artifacts, as well as establishing a Jewish iconography featuring such motifs and as columns, deer, lions, and candlesticks, such stylization became a standard form of modern Jewish art. What's interesting is that those two, Lisitsky and Rybak actually in 1916 went on an expedition of synagogues and cemeteries in the Pale of Settlement. And they actually, what they were discovering there was precisely that Yiddish folk art. They discovered a synagogue in Mogilov in Belarus with early 18th century wall painting by Marc Chagall's, actually indeed his great-grandfather. For a while it wasn't quite clear whether he just wanted to kind of own him, but he wasn't really his great-grandfather. But then more documents were unearthed proving that Chaim Segal, which was Chagall's family name before they changed it in the late 19th century to Chagall, was indeed his great-grandfather. The paintings did not preserve well, but the two artists made a record of them and restored some on paper. And you can see Lisitsky did the coloring of what he could tell by what was left of the paint on the walls. The building itself was later destroyed, and this is a photograph that they took of the dome, which was painted again by Chaim Segal. Important to bear in mind, and lots of you of course know that, and we all are watching things in our quarantine. I just watched Shtisel, and it just reminded me that the second commandment still lives. But almost all of the artists came from very religious Jewish families where artistic endeavors were frowned upon. And the commandment read, "You shall not make yourself a graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." And there's lots of sort of different discussions and interpretations of what it really meant originally, but for the hardly literate Jewish families at the time, what it meant is that you basically don't paint on canvas. When Pen was allowed to do some painting, his parents allowed him to be a house painter. And it was only later that he totally went against their will and became not a house painter. Also important to bear in mind that they were influenced and inspired by widely read Yiddish writers such as Sholem Aleichem, and from the younger generation, David Ferguson, who also founded the Yiddish Culture League, in which Rybak was active as well. We, in addition to analyzing the evolution of Russian Jewish art and individual achievements and cultural contributions of each particular artist in the seminar, we will also study larger historical, literary, and cultural issues pertaining to the Russian Pale of Settlement. This will include, of course, official anti-Semitism, quotas practiced by the Tsarist government, which limited the artists' educational and employment opportunities prior to 1917, and then, of course, what happened after the revolution. Bilingualism and biculturality. Most of the young artists actually did not speak Russian. They grew up in families where only Yiddish was spoken, and then they had to learn Russian really quickly if they wanted to leave the shtetl and sort of become part of the larger cultural scene. Secularity versus religiosity, and Yiddish culture in literature versus Yiddish culture in art. And this is the last slide, I promise. These are the books. This is Sholem Aleichem, and I will, of course, accept any addition, but this one is, I like it, and I also like it because it doesn't compare it to Fiddler on the Roof, which most other translations of Sholem Aleichem do. Beyond the Pale by Benjamin Nathans, and finally Moss's Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution. And I am done. I think it's basically almost 20 minutes accurately, right?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank
Now
you.
have a drink of water and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, I will put the slides back up. So one more time, just a reminder that this has been a little bit of a sample from a course Galya will teach in the fall. So especially for any students in the room, Russian art and architecture, painters from the Russian Pale of Jewish settlement, offered from Jewish studies and Russian, and it's 5 credits.
And also honors and art, yeah.
Yes. And then just a reminder, anyone who wants to submit a question, that's through slido.com. I have a couple of good ones so far, so I'll jump into that. How did you first encounter these painters, and what's sort of your personal history with academia and the visual arts, and Yehuda Pen specifically, someone asked about?
Well, like I said, I am passionate about painting and especially Russian painters at the turn of the century, constructivism, and so forth. And because of the connection with my father's family, and also, it also, you can never kind of pinpoint one particular source. When I was writing my book, A Russian Jew of Bloomsbury, I dealt a lot with Marc, who was a Jewish painter in England, and with Kotylyansky, who himself was from the Pale of Settlement. And I was discussing some of those painters there because one of the students of Yehuda Pen actually ended up in Taos, befriended D.H. Lawrence. His new name was Leon Gaspar. People didn't even know that he was Leiber Schulman until I actually started giving talks about that, and I gave one at the Hermitage. They thought that Leiber Schulman was forever lost. No, he reinvented himself as Leon Gaspar and totally hid his Jewishness and so forth. In 2015, I went to Vitebsk to give a talk at the Chagall Museum. And I worked in the archives there, and I was going to go back this quarter. And they also actually allowed me to go to the KGB archives and look at some of the records for my grandfather. And I kind of thought that I will probably, in my book, I will probably somehow weave in the personal history with the history of Yehuda Pen and the school. And the sort of, the main reason is I want people to know about Yehuda Pen, for example, about how absolutely essential his encouragement and his being a role model was for people like Chagall and El Lisitsky and Zatkin and so forth.
Great, thanks. One more question that I'll squeeze in because I think it's important for the topic. Just as background, what is the Jewish Pale of Settlement and why couldn't Jews settle in Petersburg?
Because Jews were not allowed to settle in Petersburg, because Jews were third and fourth rate citizens, and they had to have special permission to live in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Kiev for that matter. And sometimes you have to be declared absolutely essential. And if you had lots of money, you could settle there. For example, those of you who know Nabokov, you know that the woman he married was Jewish, Vera Slonim, but they've lived in St. Petersburg for a while, mostly because they were successful businessmen and there was money involved. Ordinarily, just a regular Jew could not go outside of the Pale of Settlement, which was in Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus.
Okay, great.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes. And I think just for time, we'll make that the last question. There are some other great questions and one comment that someone is very excited to read your Yehuda Pen book.
Thank you. I am excited to go back to Vitebsk at some point and move it along. Yes, thank you.
Yes, we're all looking forward. And I wanted to give one more reminder that the last talk in this series with Richard Block will be this time next week.
And can I also say that if people want to send me their question via email, galya@uw, I'll be happy to answer them.
Great. I can put that in the chat as well for people.
Okay,
Yes.
absolutely.
Sure. And another reminder, in case anyone wasn't here at the beginning, Thursday, May 21st is our Stroum lecture presentation. It will be online. You can register at our website. And as always, a reminder from the university that there are online counseling services. It's a great idea to talk with a counselor virtually. Let's talk.uw.edu. And I also wanted to encourage anyone who feels like they haven't gotten enough learning in yet today. I know these talks are very quick, to look at our YouTube channel, which I'll put in the chat. There is a great talk from Galya actually in 2013 that was part of our Jew Dub series. And it's called My Inner Shtetl. And of course, many others. So let me share that now.
Yeah, that was about my grandfather. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great talk, a lot of good online content. And of course, thank you, Galya, for sharing this little bit of your class with us. It was wonderful to hear, and thanks to everyone for coming to our digital talk. We look forward to more of them and hope you all have a great day.
Yeah, and I want to thank everyone again for tuning in. Thank you. It was wonderful to share it with you.
Thanks, Galya. And here is your email address and the General Jewish Studies email address. And we'll follow up with an email with some links too for everyone who registered. So thanks, and we'll see you all soon, hopefully.
Hopefully, yes.